Welcome to this webinar on implementing the PIEVC Green Protocol methodology, focused on the transition from the climate risk assessment to implementing adaptation action. In particular, we'll cover the most important elements as you begin planning adaptation, and most notably around the importance of coordination and bringing the right people to the table. We'll also apply these to practical examples. My name is Stephanie Austin from NIRAS Germany. Thanks for joining us today. The primary target audience of this webinar is practitioners such as planners and engineers, along with decision makers who are embarking upon climate risk assessments and subsequent climate change adaptation, particularly with regard to infrastructure. This webinar is part of a broader project called Enhancing National and Local Capacity to Assess and Manage Climate Change Risks in Iraq, which also includes a climate vulnerability and risk assessment for a drinking water treatment plant in Ramadi. The project is funded by GIZ, the German Development Agency, and implemented by the Climate Risk Institute. In this webinar, I'll give an overview of the PIEVC Green Protocol for Climate Risk Assessment before we get into the heart of today's topic, which, as mentioned, is on transitioning from climate risk assessments to implementing action, covering why, how, and what it looks like in practice. So we'll start by discussing why this transition is so important, then discuss key elements for how it can be done most effectively. We'll discuss some common challenges and lessons learned through mini case studies. Then we'll go in depth on a case study in Lesotho where the PIEVC Green Protocol has previously been implemented in practice. The main learning objectives from this webinar, or what you will be able to do following this webinar, are to explain the purpose and overall approach of the PIEVC Green methodology, apply good practices in implementation plan development, and identify success factors for translating assessment outputs into actionable adaptation measures. So let's begin by reviewing the PIEVC Green Protocol. The PIEVC Green Protocol is a climate risk assessment guidance with a structured but flexible process that also connects the risk assessment process to adaptation planning, or the transition from risk assessment outputs to adaptation action, the focus of this webinar. It expands on the original PIEVC protocol by integrating ecosystem and community dimensions while aligning with the IPCC AR6 concepts. More specifically, it helps assess how infrastructure interacts with climate change while considering the social and ecological systems around it. So let's dig into the social and ecological systems perspective more. Infrastructure such as drinking water utilities don't exist in isolation. It may border a river. There may be a dam influencing water availability and affected by international water agreements. There may be communities living nearby. There may be vegetation such as trees and wetlands nearby supporting water quality. There may be agriculture nearby leading to runoff in the water system. Electricity supply may not be reliable, and the drinking water facilities operations may be impacted by governance fragmentation. So all these elements are interacting risk multipliers, not just contextual features. And the PIEVC Green Protocol recognizes how important it is to consider the broader social and ecological system and how it may reduce or amplify climate risk of infrastructure. Consider now your own professional context. What elements make up the social ecological system around the infrastructure that you work with? You can consider these in terms of categories that capture both human and environmental influences, including environmental factors like watershed conditions, groundwater quantity and quality, social factors like local economic activities that shape demand, informal settlements, and water trucking markets, or governance and institutional factors like agency responsibilities and coordination mechanisms, upstream water regulations, and reliance on manual operations. So consider how these factors could increase or decrease the infrastructure's vulnerability to climate change. Take a few minutes to pause the webinar and discuss if you're in a group or to reflect if you're on your own. This framing of considering climate risk assessments of infrastructure within the context of the broader social ecological system is the core approach of the PIEVC Green Protocol. I'll briefly walk you through the core steps, but if you'd like to go more in depth, you can read through the presentation on the PIEVC Green Protocol on the Monaro platform or read through the PIEVC Green Protocol itself. So the main steps of the PIEVC Green are step 1, project definition, defining the global project parameters and boundary conditions for the climate risk assessment. Step 2, data gathering and sufficiency. So further defining the infrastructure and particular climate trends and projections that are being considered in the evaluation by developing an impact chain, conducting data acquisition, and assessing data sufficiency. Step 3 is the risk assessment itself, so combining all this information on vulnerability, exposure, and likelihood to assess climate risk. Step 4 is an optional engineering analysis, focused on conducting analysis of climate and infrastructure interactions requiring further assessment. Step 5 are the recommendations and conclusions, so based on the climate risk assessment results. And lastly, steps 6 to 8 are the needs-based triple bottom line module, identifying and assessing adaptation scenarios after completing the climate risk assessment. Again, this is a very quick overview, but if you'd like to get a more detailed look through, you can read the presentation on the PIEVC Green Protocol on the Monaro platform or read the PIEVC Green Protocol itself. You can read the description below to learn how to get access to the full PIEVC Green Protocol document. So to wrap up on the PIEVC Green Protocol, using it to assess climate risk for infrastructure has several advantages that are highly relevant to donor-funded and resource-constrained contexts such as Iraq, including enhanced risk-informed decisions. So the protocol uses systematic scoring and impact chains to highlight critical elements, enabling planners to allocate resources where they matter the most. Cost savings. This is what everyone cares about. How can we save money? So by anticipating future climate stresses, projects avoid expensive emergency measures and extend asset life cycles through proactive adaptation. Improved resilience through green and hybrid green-gray infrastructure. So the PIEVC Green encourages hybrid solutions combining nature-based and engineered approaches, delivering co-benefits like flood attenuation, water quality improvements, and biodiversity gains. The figure on the slide shows this spectrum from green to gray infrastructure, with hybrid green-gray infrastructure in the middle. Lastly, strategic alignment. So outputs from the PIEVC Green can be directly integrated into adaptation plans, policy frameworks, and funding proposals, making projects more competitive to climate finance. And this aspect of strategic alignment is a topic that we'll discuss more throughout the webinar. So let's say that you've completed the climate risk assessment. Congratulations! But are you all finished? No, of course not. We need to implement the results of the climate risk assessment and implement adaptation actions to actually reduce climate risk. So the transition from assessment outputs to action we're discussing in this webinar involves 3 specific actions. So the first is selecting priority adaptation measures. The second is planning the sequencing of implementation. And the third is integrating those actions into operational practices and strategic plans. So let's talk about why it's so important to transition to acting on the assessment results in the context of these actions. Perhaps the most obvious, we want to avoid having a shelf report. A lot of time and financial resources are invested into developing a climate risk assessment, and it'd be a waste to not use the valuable results. Second on why it's important to act on the climate risk assessment results is alignment with broader goals and the opportunity to contribute to meeting these goals. This includes, for example, linking outputs to adaptation plans and strategies such as the Nationally Determined Contributions, or the NDC, the National Adaptation Plan, or the NAP, and governorate-level plans. More concretely, you can link the assessment outputs with the NDC by documenting the linkages between the proposed adaptation measures and the NDC actions, making it clear for decision makers and donors that the actions are aligned with the national commitments. This can also in turn justify investment and attract climate finance. Beyond NDCs, the climate risk assessment outputs can be used as concrete evidence to support funding applications as well. Even where relevant institutional plans don't exist, implementing the climate risk assessment outputs typically represents win-win opportunities to strengthen operational practices and institutional governance. But you may be wondering, why should we start now if resources are limited? It's important to act promptly and strategically, and implementing measures that are quick wins and no regret are a useful tool to do this. Quick wins really matter because they create momentum, they show tangible benefits, and reduce vulnerability early on. So we're not just discussing why act at all, but also more specifically, the why act urgently and strategically. Moving on from the more general aspects of urgency and why act now, some key questions that practitioners should ask themselves when moving from assessment to action that relate in particular to the sequencing and how to act over time include: first, is it feasible under current constraints? Do we have the mandate, the budget, skilled staff, etc. to do this now? And if not, what's the minimum viable version? Second, what's the right sequencing of actions for us? Which are quick wins and no regrets measures that we can start with? And lastly, how can assessment results inform short, medium, and long-term decisions and planning horizons? The distinction between operational and strategic uses of the climate risk assessment outputs can help ensure that the actions are both realistic and aligned with long-term adaptation goals. I've mentioned connecting climate risk assessment outputs with climate change policies and planning a couple times now. So here's a good moment to stop and consider if you're familiar with Iraq's climate change planning documents. Have you ever looked at Iraq's NDC, for instance? Under the Paris Agreement, every country must submit a nationally determined contribution, or NDC, to the UN every 5 years. An NDC outlines how the country plans to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and may also include adaptation measures, which many developing countries are choosing to address. Iraq's NDC includes adaptation measures related to water, agriculture, biodiversity, and health. So these documents are publicly available. Anyone can go and find them. If you're not already familiar with Iraq's most recent NDC, submitted in November 2025, then I invite you to pause this webinar and take a look. What climate change adaptation priorities are included that's relevant to your sector or to your work? While it's not expected that you'll be deeply familiar with the NDC, it's encouraged to get an understanding of the broader policy goals for climate change adaptation in Iraq. Now that we've covered why it's important to implement the results of the climate risk assessment, let's discuss more tangibly how to act. So we'll discuss how to act in terms of strategic integration, governance and coordination, resources and technical foundations, monitoring and accountability, and communication and buy-in. So let's go through each of these one at a time. Let's start with recommendations for key strategic integration elements of how to act, or how we strategically choose actions and tie them to planning and finance. First, select adaptation measures that are clearly actionable, meaning that they are technically feasible and fit institutional capacity. For example, this could mean including relevant cleaning measures or frequency as a budget line in next year's O&M plan to reduce turbidity-related shutdowns during flood season. Second, integrate adaptation actions with organizational goals and planning cycles by mapping each action to a specific planning or budget window. For example, annual O&M plans or governorate development plans. Third, institutionalize climate risk assessment results by building them into capital planning, budget planning, and proposals, and monitoring frameworks. Lastly, explicitly align measures to sector strategies and national adaptation priorities, for example, the NDC that you just looked at, and document those linkages in project justifications and funding notes so actions are defensible, finance-ready, and easier to approve. The next key element is governance and coordination, focusing on people and roles. The most important aspect here is stakeholder engagement and coordination. In other words, this is all about bringing the right people into the room, including engineering, operations, finance, procurement, planning, environment, and the governorate. This is essential to ensure that decisions are informed by diverse perspectives, risks are fully understood, and that solutions are practical, cost-effective, and resilient. Without this coordination, adaptation measures can fail due to misaligned priorities, overlooked vulnerabilities, or lack of ownership among key actors. I recently met with city officials in the Philippines who are highly advanced in their climate change adaptation planning using nature-based solutions. The city is one of the champions of nature-based solutions in the Philippines. So I asked them, what was the key to their success? What would other municipalities have to do to follow their path? And they emphasized the same thing, that an integrated approach is essential, bringing together different offices such as environment, architecture, engineering, and city planning to understand and work together on the issue. The necessity of strong stakeholder engagement coordination is the most important takeaway from this webinar. Next on governance and coordination, it's critical to clarify roles and governance. In other words, who does what? This establishes ownership and makes organizations accountable, which is particularly important in contexts where responsibilities are distributed across multiple institutions. Lastly, building institutional ownership and cross-sector alignment by embedding adaptation responsibilities into core functions such as budgeting, design, and operations, and create joint planning and coordination mechanisms so all departments work together towards shared goals rather than in silos. Together with the key elements related to strategic intervention, these aspects largely contribute towards developing an enabling policy and regulatory environment. So again, I'd like to emphasize that governance and stakeholder coordination is the most important takeaway for successful adaptation implementation. The next key element is resources and technical foundations. This is all about creating the enabling environment for implementation. First, secure resource allocation, both financial and human. Budget lines for adaptation measures should be identified early and technical expertise secured. Sustained O&M resourcing is also needed. Second, integrate data from the climate risk assessment into planning tools. This means using the outputs to inform scenario analysis and investment decisions. Third, leverage tools and software for scenario modeling and cost-benefit analysis. These help compare adaptation options and justify investments. And without these foundations, even some of the best design plans can stop or stall. Monitoring and accountability are critical for sustaining progress. Essentially, this is tracking and reporting. Start by defining performance indicators early. Don't wait until the implementation is already underway. Indicators should track both outputs, so for example, the number of measures implemented, and outcomes, for example, the reduction in vulnerability. It might be helpful to note that indicators can be either qualitative or quantitative, especially in low automation contexts. Second, develop an implementation report structure that includes prioritized risks, timelines, KPIs, and responsibilities. This creates transparency and helps secure continued funding. The implementation report should also include clear KPIs for progress monitoring and link these indicators to periodic reviews or repeat assessments. This helps ensure that adaptation measures remain relevant and performance is tracked over time. Make sure that the reports are shared with all relevant stakeholders and define clear decision pathways that reflect both formal approval processes and informal adaptive practices that operators already use. Communication is often underestimated, but it's essential for buy-in. How many times have you seen ideas or projects fail because they weren't pitched well enough or pitched to the right person in the right way? We need to make sure to tailor messages for different audiences. So technical teams need detailed risk data, while executives need brief information with clear business cases and cost-benefit insights. Visualizing risks and benefits can really help. For example, maps, dashboards, and infographics that can make complex information more accessible. You can link adaptation actions to policy and finance opportunities to strengthen the case for investment while you're pitching it. Finally, build trust through transparency and participatory processes. In water systems, user experience and service reliability are key drivers of trust, so you can highlight how adaptation measures may improve these. Now that we've covered key elements for how to implement adaptation, transitioning from climate risk assessment outputs, let's discuss some common challenges that practitioners often face and some lessons learned that may be applicable to you. Some of the most common challenges in implementing adaptation are around data and uncertainty, change resistance in silos, budget constraints, and complex governance and misalignment. So let's go through each of these one at a time. You'll notice some overlap with the content we just discussed around how to implement, but we'll approach it from a different angle in terms of challenges and how to address them. This also reinforces good practices and approaches. A common challenge is that limited climate data or infrastructure records can stall progress and cause paralysis. So this is a challenge that can be primarily addressed through adaptive management, or in other words, something that requires iteration over time. First, you can leverage local knowledge. Treat operator and community insights as valid inputs to fill gaps. You can also fill gaps with expert knowledge. You can also use scenario planning, so develop multiple plausible futures to manage uncertainty rather than waiting for perfect data. And lastly, iterative updates. Embed periodic reviews so decisions can be refined as new data becomes available. The next common challenge is organizational inertia and fragmented responsibilities that often block action. This is a challenge that requires both planning and longer-term adaptive management to address, such as framing adaptation as efficiency. Resistance to change is often driven by workload pressures rather than a lack of awareness. It's not that people don't understand that climate change is a problem, but they're already too busy with other tasks, and it can feel like something extra on the side of their desks. But by showing how measures reduce operational burden and costs can help address this point of resistance. Creating cross-functional teams. So bringing engineering, finance, environment, and planning together early to help build shared ownership. This is that lesson learned that I also shared from the Philippines, that this city found was the most effective way to get started and to really have effective adaptation and nature-based solutions, bringing together the right people from across different functions or different sectors. Piloting quick wins. So demonstrating tangible benefits through small-scale actions can really help build momentum. And lastly, leadership champions. Identifying and empowering internal advocates to drive change has been shown over and over to be very effective in getting going on implementing adaptation. As you probably already noticed in your day-to-day work, there's always a strong competition for limited budget, with adaptation measures being one of these priorities. Budget constraints can be addressed through planning by prioritizing no-regret measures. So this means focusing on actions that deliver benefits under any future scenario. You can also seek out co-benefits. This means selecting adaptation measures that can also provide other benefits, such as improving service reliability, biodiversity, or social outcomes. Nature-based solutions are a great way to seek out co-benefits. Let's take the example of riparian buffer zones, or in other words, strips of vegetation like trees, shrubs, or grasses along riverbanks. These could be a potential adaptation measure for a drinking water facility by trapping sediments, nutrients, and pollutants before they enter the river, thereby improving raw water quality and reducing treatment costs. At the same time, this measure would have many co-benefits, such as stabilizing the riverbank. This in turn can actually also lower turbidity spikes associated with erosion. Planting vegetation as riparian buffer zones can also improve ecosystem resilience and support carbon sequestration. This is just one example of a type of adaptation measure, and in this case specifically nature-based solution, that can have many other co-benefits, making the money spent on the measure have even more returns. Another way to get around budget constraints is linking to policy priorities and funding opportunities. You've heard us say this a few times, but aligning actions with Iraq's NDC, sector plans, and donor priorities to attract climate finance can really help. Lastly is phased implementation. So spread costs out over short, medium, and long-term planning cycles. I've used the term nature-based solutions a few times now, and it's relevant to the case study we'll discuss, so let's take a moment to pause and discuss the definition. The most commonly used definition is from the IUCN, and it says that NBS, or nature-based solutions, are actions to protect, sustainably use, manage, and restore natural or more modified ecosystems, which address societal challenges, effectively and adaptively providing human well-being and biodiversity benefits. So, in short, nature-based solutions are ways to use nature to solve problems, be it, for example, climate change, flooding, or pollution. So let's look now at a real-world example of how budget constraints can be addressed using co-benefits. In the Shenzhen area of southern China, the city government was planning to rebuild coastal defenses over 18 kilometers to improve resilience against the effects of climate change, including rising sea levels and storm surges. For example, a typhoon in the region had already destroyed sections of the existing seawall, displaced millions of people, and disrupted transportation. The Shenzhen city government developed the joint objectives of improving coastal defenses and reestablishing native habitats. The region has diverse marine habitats and a coastline protection area. So there was some consideration about the use of nature-based solutions, which they thought could provide support on both objectives of providing physical protection while also supporting habitats and improving ecology and biodiversity. So they conducted assessments of baseline of existing ecosystem services across the coastal area. They assessed the potential change between the baseline and the scenario where nature-based solutions were implemented. And the studies actually demonstrated the potential for the benefits of nature-based solutions in their case over conventional or so-called hard infrastructure, not only for coastal defense related to climate change, but also economic benefits. So for example, mitigating future costs of repairing damage to infrastructure and measures that were complementing local coastal tourism. So this caused the city government to reconsider their bias towards conventional hard infrastructure and to consider a nature-based solutions approach. So the lessons learned were early consideration of ecosystem services, addressing biases and resistance to change head on. Now, China may seem a very far away from Iraq, but a key takeaway for you is the importance of seeking out co-benefits and seeking these out early on in the design, and the opportunity to tackle multiple challenges through one measure. Now, misaligned mandates and complex governance arrangements, such as overlapping jurisdictions, can complicate coordination and can hinder adaptation implementation. This is really important to address head on, because this is one of the most important aspects for a success of adaptation implementation is getting the coordination right. So addressing this challenge can be done through both planning and adaptive management by mapping institutional roles, so clarifying who does what and identifying gaps or overlaps, by using existing platforms, so leveraging interagency committees or sector working groups to ensure legitimacy, by formalizing agreements, so developing MOUs or coordination protocols to ensure accountability, and by building trust through transparency. Trust is so important here. This can mean sharing data and decisions openly to reduce friction between agencies. Now let's look at an example from Mexico of how they addressed complex governance challenges as part of integrated basin management planning to increase water resilience and security. So this is a context with a stressed water system, water scarcity, but also wanting to take into account future climate change related shocks and stresses. Ecosystems in that area were already significantly damaged. Much of the Lerma River had already been affected by untreated or undertreated wastewater being discharged into the river for several decades. So initially, the government of Mexico planned to do a diagnostic of an aqueduct and other gray infrastructure which needed maintenance. After some preliminary studies, they decided to adopt a more holistic approach, looking at water supply at a catchment level to identify vulnerabilities and ensure long-term sustainable solutions to their water supply issues. So they conducted a collaborative planning process, consulting local stakeholders to understand and define their aims and metrics of success for the water system. So not just what does success look like at the catchment level for the government planners, but talking to stakeholders, what does success look like for them? What are their objectives for the water system? So this led to an increased focus on environmental management, since stakeholders wanted to see the restoration of the water systems. This process of consultation also helped to build ownership of the project among stakeholders. Some of the challenges they faced were complex planning, institutional, legal, and regulatory boundaries that generally just didn't align well with water catchment boundaries. So the solution they found was that the project team used the basin councils as an entry point to engage with a range of stakeholders, since the basin councils already had the legitimacy to bring together different user groups across the whole catchment area. A human hydrological model was developed to evaluate the performance of different proposed investment, and each investment option was then assessed for yield, increase of resilience of the system, and cost of the investment. So the big success factors here were strong stakeholder relationships across multiple authorities and boundaries. The lesson was that early technical modeling plus strong institutional coordination enabled really robust and cross-boundary decisions. So again, while Mexico may seem far away, a key takeaway that can be applied in Iraq is the use of existing engagement platforms like the Basin Council in this example as an entry point for stakeholder coordination and engagement. Now that we've gone through all of these common challenges to implementing assessment outputs and implementing adaptation, let's take a moment for self-reflection. Which of these challenges resonates the most with you in your working context and experience, be it related to climate change adaptation or to your day-to-day work? Is it data and uncertainty, change resistance and silos, budget constraints, complex governance and misalignment, or maybe all of the above? And how can these challenges be addressed in your context? Are there any solutions that we discussed that would be applicable for you? For example, prioritizing co-benefits, framing as efficiency, leveraging local knowledge, or maybe using existing platforms. So take a moment to pause the video, discuss if you're with other people, or think about it yourself, and reflect on these questions. Now that you've had some time to reflect on these common challenges and your own context, let's take a deeper dive into another practical example. So we've gone from China to Mexico and now to Lesotho in Southern Africa, where the PIEVC Green Protocol was previously implemented. Let's dive into our case study first with some context for the climate risk assessment and its initial findings. So for context, this is the Metalong Dam in Lesotho, as I mentioned, in Southern Africa. It is an 83-meter dam serving 2/3 of Lesotho's population. So it's completely critical for water supply and economic growth. The climate risk assessment was conducted in 2023 using the PIEVC Green Protocol and applying a systems view across 3 scales. So first, the watershed and reservoir. Second, the dam and water treatment plant. And third, the users and conveyance. The process they used was highly participatory. They engaged over 50 stakeholders through workshops, interviews, and field visits. The climate risk assessment identified many climate risks, including increased sedimentation in the watershed and reservoir due to erosion and heavy rainfall, extreme precipitation leading to flooding and subsequent infrastructure damage, heat waves leading to pump failures and water quality issues, and lightning and wildfires leading to ICT damage and safety risks. Now, as we go through and continue discussing the Lesotho case study, I'd like you to consider if there are any parallels to your own context or any approaches that could be relevant for you. Some of the key components of implementation in this case were that 3 working groups were institutionalized, one at each the watershed level, the dam and water treatment plant level, and third, the user level, so that they could own their decisions and help keep momentum. Quick wins were delivered to likewise build early momentum. Now remember that quick wins is one of the approaches that we discussed to address change resistance and silos, and was found to be especially useful here. In this case, quick wins included O&M updates, post-event inspections, and backup power feasibility to reduce near-term risks and demonstrate value. Hybrid solutions were applied, pairing ecosystem services with engineered solutions. So these are those nature-based solutions that I mentioned, or we can call these green-gray solutions. And in a moment, I'll show you some more examples of these. This use of nature-based solutions also helped bring in co-benefits to the adaptation measures. A phased delivery roadmap was also developed, sequencing actions into short, medium, and long-term packages aligned to budgets and capacity. And lastly, monitoring and reassessment was planned for, with KPIs for performance, for example, turbidity spikes, pump trips, and outage duration, and routine reporting and periodic PIEVC reassessments to adjust as conditions evolve. Some of the key lessons learned from the project were that systems thinking matters. We can't look at things in isolation, especially since most dam risks start at the catchment level. We also learned that sedimentation is critical in the context of the Metalong Dam and should be treated as a long-term program, not a one-off project that can just be fixed and dealt with. Local knowledge was also a lesson learned, that local knowledge is an essential core input, not a fallback plan. And that lastly, institutionalization is possible through governance, KPIs, and scheduled reassessments. On this slide, you can see the spectrum of green to gray adaptation measures that were proposed in the context of the Metalong Dam based on the climate risk assessment results. On the right, you can see the conventional operational measures, or measures that use gray infrastructure, including lightning protection and flood barriers. On the far left, you can see green infrastructure or nature-based solutions that were proposed, such as afforestation and riparian buffers, so planting vegetation along the riverside, like we discussed earlier, but also wetland reforestation and climate-smart agriculture. In the middle, there was also a hybrid green-gray measure proposed, in this case, sediment control structures. Special attention in this project was paid to communication and engagement throughout the process. The team used a so-called Made in Lesotho approach with continuous participation from stakeholders throughout every stage to ensure both ownership and data quality, since local operator and community knowledge filled critical data gaps. They also made sure to tailor communication messages to each audience. Now, a sensitive but important topic in the context of this project was upstream communities who didn't actually directly receive Metalong water. The team addressed that openly, exploring alternative supply options and catchment stewardship roles that reframed the conversation from exclusion to co-benefits and helped rebuild trust. The team was also transparent about uncertainty. but at the same time differentiated between different levels of uncertainty. So we've covered a lot of ground in this webinar. We've talked about an overview on the PIEVC Green Protocol process, advantages, and a discussion of the social ecological system. We've talked about why transition from assessment outputs to adaptation implementation is important and urgent. We've talked about key elements for how to transition to implementation, including common challenges that many practitioners face and how to address these. And we've looked at what implementation looks like in practice with examples from China, Mexico, and a more in-depth example from Lesotho. Throughout, I hope that you've taken the opportunities to self-reflect. We've self-reflected on the social ecological system around the infrastructure in your working context. We've explored Iraq's NDC to familiarize yourself with Iraq's climate change adaptation priorities. And you've reflected on common challenges that you face in your work and how they relate to those that we discussed in an adaptation context and how you might address them. Now let's recap the key takeaways we've discussed. So first is coordination is non-negotiable. As discussed, this is perhaps the most important takeaway from today. Bringing the right people, and more specifically a diverse group of stakeholders, can help reduce misalignment and foster ownership. A structured process is really important. The PIEVC Green Protocol is a great example of this that you can use. It's a clear step-by-step process that can lead to prioritized, defensible actions while also considering the entire social ecological system. You can start small and scale up. You can pilot things quickly, learn fast, and expand on what actually works. You can seek easy wins and no regret options. Make sure to prioritize actions that perform well across different scenarios that have co-benefits like O&M upgrades or catchment measures that also improve water quality. Communication. Communication is key for buy-in, in particular tailored messages and being transparent. Linking policy and finance. We've talked about this many times. You can map measures to policy goals like NDCs or local plans for buy-in, but also to improve finance opportunities. And lastly, operators are key actors in adaptation. In resource-constrained contexts especially, day-to-day operators are not just part of the system, they are decision makers who already practice adaptive management. If you embed them in working groups, fund their tools and training, and capture their insights, they will bring immense value to the adaptation process. I invite you to participate in one more self-reflection as we wrap up. So please consider these questions. What did you learn in this webinar that's most relevant to your working context? What's one action that you'll take following this webinar? Is there something that you're going to do tomorrow? Is there something that you're going to do next month? Is there something that you have in mind that you can take next year? So feel free to pause the webinar while you discuss or reflect on these questions. I've included here on the slide some resources that you might find useful, and you can also find links to these in the webinar description. Here are the key sources used to develop this presentation in case you'd like to read more in depth about any of the case studies, for instance. And lastly, I'd like to thank you for participating in this webinar and for giving your time. I hope you found it informative and relevant, and I wish you the best of luck as you embark on your own climate risk assessment and subsequent transition to implementation.